Medieval Europe. Throughout its long history, it has been the birthplace of many diplomatic treaties. During the 14th and 15th centuries, a war would come to rise that would change diplomatic relations in Europe and change the governmental structure of England and France. This war would come to be known as the 100 Years' War. Officially, the war started in the 1330s, but conflicts between England and France stretched back many years. Before the actual 100 Years of War started, there was a previous 100 years of conflict between the Plantagenets and Capetians, better known as the Kingdom of France and England. The Treaty of Paris ended this previous conflict because Louis IX and Henry III wanted to make peace as each country was in poverty, leading to many revolts. Louis and Henry debated how to make this happen and came together and decided to end the war. The Treaty of Paris was signed on May 28, 1258, and due to the generosity of Louis IX, Henry III was to obtain the land of Aquitaine as long as Henry considered himself as a vassal of Louis IX. Although this treaty didn't directly affect the real 100 Years' War, it gave a standard as to how relations could become during the later war that started in 1337, only 79 years later. Edward III was the King of England between 1327 and 1377. Once the French king died, he claimed that he would have the right to the French throne due to his mother, Isabella of France, being of French descent. Edward was the closest male relative, as he was the nephew to the King of France. Philip VI was the cousin of the French king, but was not as closely related as Edward III was. Obviously, the French preferred him on the throne over Edward, as Edward was English, and the French would rather have a king from their own country as to a prince from a foreign land. So Philip VI took the French throne. Edward III was angry that his birthright of the French kingdom was taken away from him, and made him want to go to war. But things really started to heat up when the ambitious King Philip confiscated the Duchy of Guerre in 1337, which was owned by England at the time. This event was the last straw for Edward, and he went to invade French territory. Even though conflicts of the war date back to 1259, this was the conventional start of the 100 Years' War. The first major battle of the war was the Battle of Crecy on August 26, 1346. This battle started once Edward III landed in Calais in northern France with 10,000 men by his side. In this battle, the very outnumbered army of Edward III won on the French's home field using the lethal longbow. The longbow is a type of bow that shoots arrows from far distances due to its long draw. This gave the English an early advantage in the war. Thankfully, some accounts of this great battle still exist to this day, mainly through the personal works of Jean Froisson.
And they went in among the men of arms, and slew and murdered many as they lay on the ground, both earls, barons, knights, and squires, whereof the King of England was rather displeased, for he had rather they had been taken prisoners.
Nearly 4,000 men were slain that day. This battle was used as a message to the French kingdom that war was inevitable. This was the first sign of a huge war between the opposing countries of England and France due to the English's might despite being outnumbered, and the fact that there would be many more battles to come. After about 10 years of rest, the next battle occurred. It took place on September 19, 1356, and would come to be called the Battle of Poitiers. This battle was by far the most diplomatic of all battles fought during the 100 Years' War due to the treaty made following it. During this time, England was led by Edward the Black Prince, son of Edward III, while John II was the King of France. Longbow archers were used yet again to hold back the French until the French retreated. The English successfully captured John II and his son in the process of commandeering forts of Poitiers. This was a turning point for the war, as the capture of King John was the drive for the French to come up with a diplomatic solution to regain their king. Due to the capture of King John II, the French asked the English to make a treaty in an attempt to regain their ruler. The English accepted, and both rivaling sides came to form an agreement. English and French diplomats decided after months of discussion to give England land in northern France and 3 million gold crowns as long as the English relieved their spot on the French throne and relieved King John II from his imprisonment. Ultimately, this treaty was desperately needed since both sides were in great financial debt. The Battle of Agincourt, in an overall perspective, was a very important victory for the English. It occurred on October 25, 1415 in Agincourt, an area in northern France. Although this battle is famous for many reasons, the diplomatic influences on its outcome reach back to the days of Henry IV of England. He made peace in the Low Countries while maintaining strong connections to Castile, one of the Iberian kingdoms which are located in Spain. He also created an extended truce between the English and the Scots after the capture of James I. Thomas of Lancaster, the eldest son of Henry IV, was able to obtain a ransom of £40,000 to go away and eventually funded his campaign in southern France. The battle itself was like any other. Bloody, the death toll was somewhat high on both sides, the mass use of bows, and yet another victory for the English during their march in France. But the significance that came after the army arrived in England is very important for the stature of not only the reverence of the army, but its king. Dr. David Green, Ph.D., tells how the English gained not only a strategical advantage, but an inspirational one as well.
And it portrays a very particular image of an English army that's been sort of broken up by disease, that's hugely outnumbered, and that finds itself against this sort of arrogant French force which is vastly superior in numerical terms, and there is almost some sort of divinely inspired victory that comes from it.
This battle tested the wits of Henry V's position as king. It had been threatened ever since he took the throne. It gave England a backbone after 50 years of military failure, and a relief knowing that the fate of the country was in the hands of a great ruler that could change the war in England's favor. Later on, Henry V would go on to claim Paris, northern France, and Normandy. He would even make himself the successor to the French throne by marrying Charles VI's daughter, Catherine, which was agreed upon in the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. Although it may seem as if England is winning at this point, the French pulled one of the most intricate and successful diplomatic agreements. They secured their country with an experienced and valiant king to lead them to eventually win the war. In the 1420s, the English were trying to take the city of Orleans through a siege. This is when Joan of Arc, one of the most influential figures in the war, arose and led the French army to win. A young peasant girl who could barely read or write defeated the overpowering English army in Orleans in just 9 days. When they began to realize how good of a leader and an influence she was in the French army, the French came to use her furthermore to help their campaign in defeating the English. During this time, she also wrote letters to the English king to settle the war through diplomacy, such as the letter to the King of England on March 22, 1429. The interesting thing about her was that she wasn't truly writing these letters herself. The French were trying to use her as a way to debate with the English for upcoming battles, especially for the siege of Orleans. In the letter for the English king, she, along with the French government, tried to put an end to the bloodshed. The French used her to help with the ongoing diplomacy through the war, and eventually won over at Orleans. This was a major turning point in the war for the French, further advancing the leverage they had in their debate. The ending of the war came as England lost control during the early kingship of Henry VI. Other attempted invasions came in the later years of the 1400s, but with the rise of the Wars of the Roses, England was too engaged to support its attempt to reclaim the ground lost 25 to 30 years prior. This marks what historians consider to be the end of the 100 Years' War.